architect at Salesforce. And the primary focus of his work is on DNS, the domain name system, networking and security protocols. And prior to Salesforce, he was a principal research scientist at VeriSign Labs. And then before that, he worked for roughly 2 decades at the University of Pennsylvania, prototyping, deploying protocols like DNSSEC and IPv6. So Shumon is also an active participant in the Internet Engineering Task Force, or IETF, which is basically the main standardized development organization for all the internet protocols that we rely on every day. And he is also serving on the board of directors of DNSORG, which is the organization for basically everyone in industry and researchers in academia working on DNS. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Shumon.
Great. Thank you, Yixin. Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. So the subject of my talk today is recent developments in the evolution of the domain name system. And towards the end, I'm also going to talk a little bit about academic contributions in this space and ways that you could help. And I'm hoping that part of the talk will be more of a conversation rather than me just telling you things, right? So with that, let's get started. How do I? The first problem is how to, okay, good. Let's skip over some boilerplate stuff. So here's a rough outline of the talk. I'm not going to go through it yet and just jump into a review of the domain name system. So I think most people in engineering and the technology industry at least have an intuitive understanding of what the DNS already is, right? So, and I suspect some of you in the audience even have an advanced grasp of the topic, but I'm going to give you the basics anyway, so please bear with me. The DNS is a hierarchical, tree-structured namespace for the internet, and it is composed of domain names, and domain names are ways of identifying resources on the internet, such as a computer or an application service or a network, in a human-friendly textual form, such as the thing that you see on the screen there, www.amazon.com. It is quite an old protocol. So if you look at the original specifications, they date back to 1987. So that's 36 years, I think. So it's probably older than a lot of you in the room. And remarkably, it's still intact and going strong. The DNS database is globally distributed, but it has decentralized operation, and it has a client-server name lookup protocol, which I'm going to describe in a bit. So the most common piece of information in the DNS is what's called an address record. So these are things probably you've all seen. So they're a way to map a domain name to a numeric IP address. What is less well known is the DNS can also be used to store a variety of other types of information. And I'm just going to give you a few examples in the following table. So there are records that store addresses of various types, IPv4, IPv6. There are things to manage DNS zones, to designate mail servers for a domain, to store free-form text, sometimes with application imposed semantics, locating services, and a whole bunch of types having to do with authentication and cryptography. So the typical way of, hey, can I get rid of that thing somehow? How do I do that? Can I just drag this here? Sorry, I need technical help. I apologize. Excellent. All right, good. All right, so the typical way to visualize the DNS namespace is as a tree of labels. And labels are the constituent parts of a domain name. So think of them as, in the text form, the things between the dots. Each of those are a label. So at the top of the tree, we have the root label or the null label. Underneath that are the various top-level domains like com, .org, US, etc. And below that are second-level domains that are typically delegated to distinct organizations, Google and Amazon, that I'm showing here. Each node in the tree corresponds to a domain name. And the way you compute the domain name is you just start at that node and you enumerate all the labels walking up to the root of the tree. So that's the domain. I mentioned that the DNS has decentralized administration, and how that is achieved is by dividing the namespace into autonomously managed subtrees. So each of the light gray boxes that you see in this diagram, these each correspond to a zone. The zone can be just one label, or it could be many labels deep, a tree that composes many labels. And the delegations are the boundaries between the zone. And what we say happens is we structure a new subtree as a DNS zone, and then we hand it off for administration autonomously to some organization, right? And then they can manage all the contents of that DNS zone and everything below it, including delegated a subtree below it to somebody else, right? So that's the way the DNS basically works. And how does the DNS packet flow work? So this is a common diagram that we use to show the DNS iterative resolution, what it's called. So on the to the right side of this diagram, we have what are called authoritative servers for each zone in the hierarchy of the DNS namespace. So at the top, we have authoritative servers for the root zone, and then for .com, and underneath that, Amazon.com. To the bottom left, we have what's called a stub resolver, and this is a piece of DNS client code that essentially runs on your laptop or your computer or your phone. And it's very simple. All it does is sends out DNS queries and waits for responses. And typically it sends queries to a more capable system called a recursive server or a resolver, a full resolver. They have many different types of names. Essentially, the job of the recursive server is to navigate the hierarchy of DNS zones in the namespace and figure out where to get the answer to the query it was given. And in order to do this navigation, it needs to be pre-populated with an essential piece of bootstrapping information. And that's the thing that I mentioned up here, just the IP addresses of the root servers. Once it does that, it can contact the root servers, follow referrals to downstream zones, and then eventually get to the zone that contains the answer to the query that it received. All right, so I'm going to kind of gloss over this section a little bit and mostly talk about more technical topics, but there are some recent developments in the DNS industry itself that you may want to be familiar with. And the first, very quickly, is something called the IANA functions transition. And what happened there is that is the process by which the US government relatively recently, voluntarily, by the way, took itself out of the role of authority of the root zone, right? For many reasons I won't go into, mostly political. And so it's left to ICANN and VeriSign to cooperatively manage the root zone. So that's a kind of important event that happened. And the other thing that happened recently is a large expansion in the availability of the top-level domains, right? So originally, we just had a handful of generic top-level domains like comnet.org and a whole bunch of two-letter TLDs corresponding to every country. Now we have a slew of others, like 1,154 new ones, right? So the domain name industry is of course, a business, so people want to grab this kind of valuable real estate at the top of the DNS hierarchy and see if they can get people to pay to register domains under it, right, and become rich. So we'll see how many people get to get to earn that privilege. But let's move on to more technical topics. So how can we evolve the DNS protocol to incorporate new features and new capabilities? And relatedly, is it useful to do that? And are there any downsides to do that? And is it even possible to do that in a protocol as old and as entrenched as the DNS? So it turns out that people have thought about this a long time ago, and almost 20 years ago, a framework for extending the DNS incrementally was developed. It's called the EDNS, or Extension Mechanisms for DNS. And what it does is it allowed the removal of many archaic constraints that were imposed by the original DNS protocol, like packet sizes. It also allowed the signaling of new capabilities in the DNS. and the ability to use those new capabilities via miscellaneous flags and bits, right? So I mentioned a few of them. We won't go into them in much detail right now. But so over the years, many new capabilities have been developed. So that led to another question about whether or not the DNS protocol has become too complex. And some people have argued that it has. If you look at the sheer volume of protocol specification documents that describe the complete DNS system, it's quite large. There's like 200 RFCs you have to read, believe it or not. So really only deep experts can spend the time reading and understanding them in enough detail to be able to implement the DNS system correctly. And I say that because there are lots of very bad DNS implementations out there, right, in middle boxes and small devices typically. And they cause a huge problem when you want to evolve the DNS with new capabilities because you're constantly blocked by these poorly functioning or malfunctioning devices. So as a result, there's often significant pushback in the industry when you try to propose a new feature. And people generally say, hey, do we really need to do this? Do we really need to complicate the DNS protocol more? I'm not going to go through this example. This is just for reference. It's in the slide deck if you want to read it. But this is a kind of an absurd example of truly bad code. And just read it later and prepare to be shocked. I have a description of what it does. So this is kind of the state of DNS software that you often find in the field. And it's really terrible. And it's kind of depressing when you think about it. So another feature in the evolution of the DNS that's happened over time is the gradual emergence of what are called non-standard features. So these are mostly proprietary features developed by some commercial DNS providers. And they're non-standard in the sense that there is no formal DNS protocol specification or RFC document that describes how they work, right? So, but these are out there. These are working DNS implementations in the field. And a lot of these features can be lumped generally because they behave in the same sort of way under a common term, which we call traffic management. And they're kind of dynamic features like global server load balancing, probing, health checks and probing records, proportional responses, and even custom program responses. And what problems do they cause? Well, over a decade ago, Paul Vixie, a very well-known character in the DNS industry, famously critiqued these features in an article that he wrote. And he had a very colorful name for them, which, because I'm polite, I'm not going to repeat what that name is, but you can read the document. But essentially, he makes some very cogent points, and that these mechanisms make the DNS more complex, harder to debug. They are arguably implemented in the wrong layer of the stack and should have been done somewhere else, and that they represent a form of cost shifting, unfair cost shifting from certain application service providers, he meant CDNs mostly, to DNS network infrastructure operators. But be that as it may, these features are here to stay. And there's a little bit of a tussle going on, and we have to just deal with the reality of how pervasively these mechanisms are deployed. And interestingly enough, in a symposium a few years ago, Paul Moka-Petris, who you might know is the inventor of the DNS, even he remarked that ultimately the DNS protocol probably has to evolve to store programs and not just data. And that's, in a sense, what has been happening with these kind of dynamic, non-standardized features, albeit in a haphazard, uncoordinated fashion, right? So I think really we should be sitting down and trying to standardize these traffic management features. But there again, we run into some obstacles because whenever we broach this conversation with some of the DNS providers, you get pushback and resistance because a lot of them feel that, hey, this is a proprietary feature that I developed. It's my secret sauce and my competitive advantage. I'm not going to disclose the details of how it works. I don't want to standardize it, right? So there's a little bit of a push and pull going on in this area. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. And this is something, an important development in the development of the evolution of the DNS. And it's something that started to happen, but it's still in the midst of happening. And this is the deployment of DNSSEC. And what it means is data origin authentication. You may know that the original DNS protocol was completely insecure, right? So it was developed at a different time. Responses could be easily spoofed, not only by inline attackers, but a whole category of blind attacks called cache poisoning are also possible and regularly happen, right? So a while back, a framework was developed to take care of this called DNSSEC. And what it is a system to verify the authenticity of data in the DNS, so specifically data. And it does this by cryptographically signing DNS zones and returning public key signatures with DNS responses. So it helps detect and defeat DNS spoofing, cache poisoning, and all that. And I'm going to just show you the old diagram that I just showed you a few slides ago, but this time I've added in red the new protocol elements that DNSSEC brings into the picture. So first, each of these zones on the right side is signed, right, with their own public keys. And the public keys of each zone are organized in a chain of trust that precisely follows the DNS delegation hierarchy. And responses from these servers are returned with these signatures now. And the resolver in this picture has a new name. We call it a validating resolver. Why? Because it is querying for and validating or authenticating the signatures that it receives from the authoritative servers, right? So everyone with me so far, or have I lost folks? Yes? Okay, all right, I'm seeing nods, so it's good. Here's just a quick example showing a DNS lookup with a very common DNS debugging tool. And I'm showing with DNSSEC, you get a bunch of gobbledygook at the bottom, which is not for human consumptions, but it's for computer algorithms to process and verify the signature for, right? Okay, what's the status of deployment of DNSSEC in the internet today? Well, nothing really happened until the DNS root was signed, because that's kind of a prerequisite. DNS is a hierarchical system, right? And that was done in July of 2010. And in the years after that, a lot of the top-level domains followed suit. And at this point, I would say, although you should double check me and look at the numbers in the report later, the most of the TLEs today are signed and offer DNSSEC. The ongoing challenge is how to get DNSSEC deployed more extensively in the layers below the top-level domains. Because if you think about it, that's where all the application services live, right? Google.com, Amazon.com, that's where you want the protection. So it's essential to get DNSSEC down to that layer. And there the picture is much worse, I would say, right? So much sparser deployment of DNSSEC. There are pockets of the industry, US government agencies, some country code top-level domain in other countries, which have a very high degree of DNSSEC deployment. But if you look at let's say the biggest generic top-level domain.com, adoption is still disappointingly slow. So disappointingly low. So it's less than 4% in .com. So that has to gradually be improved, and I hope it will be. I think I missed a slide. Okay, so the other part, if we look at not signing the zones, but resolvers doing validation of DNSSEC, the picture is much better. So the US government agencies all extensively do DNSSEC validation. All the big public resolvers in the internet, like Google, Cloudflare, Quad9, they all do it. Lots of ISPs, including the biggest one in the world, Comcast, do it extensively. And worldwide, if you look, there's quite a lot of validation going on. So here's a map and statistics prepared by APNIC, the I guess the Pan-Asian Regional Internet Registry. And they use some tricks to measure what proportion of DNS queries are doing DNSSEC validation. And if you look at this graph, there's a lot of red, but there's a lot of yellow and green there, which is a good thing. In the United States, if you look at it, more than 1/3 of the queries are doing DNSSEC validation. In the Nordic countries, there is extremely high penetration. In some other countries in Europe, I would say that this map is a little bit illusory, though. You're probably looking at it and scratching your head and saying, okay, Greenland, why is Greenland? Everyone knows Greenland is the hotbed of the world's top DNS security experts, right? I didn't know that, right? But that's really probably not what happened. Probably what happened is Greenland has 2 or 3 ISPs, and they pointed all their DNS to Google public DNS, right? And then they magically showed up as green on this graph, right? So take it with a grain of salt, but the essential point I'm trying to convey is that there's a lot of DNSSEC validation going on in the internet. Oh, that is a good question. So if this were a lot, I would say that is probably a little bit less than US. If you go to this URL and you hover over it, it'll tell you the exact percentage, but I don't know. Maybe it's 20%, I'm going to guess, is what I guess. All right, so another challenge that DNSSEC has to deal with, and often lots of new protocols have to deal with, like IPv6 does constantly, is do we really need it, right? Is there any compelling need to deploy DNSSEC? Applications ultimately are protected at higher layers, like with TLS and certificates anyway. But if you believe in the mantra of defense in depth and that we need to detect attacks as early as possible, that implies that we really need to cryptographically protect every layer of the stack, not just applications. So we need to secure the routing layer with RPKI, we need to secure DNS with DNSSEC, and so forth. And it is not true that TLS always protects you. So there are cases where attacks do happen. I'm going to give you just one example. There was a cryptocurrency wallet company a few years ago called MyEtherWallet, and they were victimized by a combined routing and DNS spoofing attack, right? And TLS did not protect their victims, and they lost a lot of money, right? So these kind of things. Soon after this incident, this company moved off their existing cloud provider deliberately to a cloud provider that offered both RPKI, route origin validation, and DNSSEC protection for exactly that reason. So it's important, right? Despite. Okay, yes, right. Okay, that's good to know.
I knew what I was going to do, but it helps. I checked the DNS later, and my letter of guarantee for mixing my funds was a different domain than the domain that I.
Oh no, yes, right. Okay, so that's a case in point. We need security for the DNS system, right? So yeah, that's another case, right? So TLS often doesn't for a variety of reasons we can talk about, but that's another lecture, right? So okay, so let's talk about a follow-on topic, which is the potential use of DNSSEC as a PKI. This is kind of a natural follow-on to DNSSEC. So if you think about it, what DNSSEC provides is a cryptographically authenticated distributed database of information, right? So, okay, so what am I authenticating? I'm authenticating mappings of domain names to IP addresses or mail server identities. But you could put all sorts of other things in the DNS. You could put public keys and certificates and magically turn the DNS into a PKI, okay? So that's what DANE does. DANE is an acronym, a little bit of an ungainly one. It stands for DNS-based authentication of named entities. But what it is using signed DNS to store cryptographic credentials like public keys or certificates and having them used by application security protocols. But differently than the public CA system, using a system that naturally supports namespace constraints, okay? So you get to issue these assertions only in your part of the namespace. You can't do it to any other part, right? That's an important security property that DNSSEC has. So in theory, this could provide an alternative to the public CA, the web PKI system. Alternatively, you could also imagine using it in a complementary way by applying constraints on the use of the public CAs. But like you can put an assertion in the DNS that says, hey, for my services in virginia.edu, you should only trust DigiCert to sign my certificates. You are not allowed to trust DigiNotar or Symantec or one of the bad CAs that got compromised, right? So you can imagine doing this with the system. All right, so just to make things a little bit more concrete, I'm going to show you an example of how to do this with DANE. DANE has a record called TLSA, which allows you to store certificates or public keys, or more commonly, a cryptographic hash of one of those things and stick it in the DNS. So this is a real example of freebsd.org's website. And what they did was stick a hash of their the web server's server certificate in the DNS, signed with DNSSEC. So the thing at the bottom, that's the signature we think. So you can trust it if you do full DNSSEC validation with this response. So in theory, if web servers were willing, you could fully authenticate the FreeBSD website without needing any public CAs, right? So that sounds like a very interesting topic. Is it good to do that? Why is it good to do that, right? Or why is it bad to do that? That's an interesting question. And to kind of, I'm going to skip over this slide, which just dissects the details of a TLSA record. To understand why it might be good to use an alternative PKI, we need to understand what are the weaknesses in the existing public key system, and there are many. So it is commonly called a web PKI. Sometimes it's called the internet PKI, but that's a little bit of a misnomer for reasons I won't go into now. But basically what we have is a system that is composed of a very large number of globally trusted root CAs, okay? And they have absolutely no constraints on the namespace in which they can operate. Any one of them can issue a certificate for any entity on the internet, right? It doesn't matter whether we have a business relationship with any of them, and our collective security is thus equivalent to the weakest of them, right? It's a terrible property for any security system. Yeah, so there is a barrier to creating a CA. So you can't just like decide to create a CA. You have to be accepted into the club of CAs, right?
Isn't it pretty easy?
It's debatable. It used to be easy. Now they have a sort of a cabal called the web, the CAB forum, the CA browser forum. So they have a set of rules and regulations which they think are very stringent that you have to comply with before they accept you into any of their root CA programs. There is a barrier to entry. However, the problem is there are way too many CAs that have crossed that barrier, okay, which creates a security problem because there's too many things we have to trust. And it only takes the compromise of one of them to take down the system, right? That's a very bad property. And it's worse than that, actually, because if you look, many of the root CAs in turn issue subordinate CAs to their enterprise customers, also with no name CAs. Right? So there's a wonderful paper. It's a little bit dated now, but its essential analysis is still correct, that analyzed how weak and what a gigantic attack surface this system has. So you should definitely look it up and read the details. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yes,
or?
yes,
Yeah, okay, good.
yes.
So the next issue is revocation. So that means the act of invalidating a certificate of public key if it's been compromised. And this process works extremely poorly in the existing web PKI. So certificates generally have very long validity periods, much longer than they should be. There are certificate revocation lists, but they're very big and ungainly and not amenable to real-time checking. There are systems that allow real-time checking of certificate status, like OCSP, but they have collateral problems, such as they have a big privacy leak. They allow a CA to basically track which websites you're visiting. That's a terrible thing. There are ways to prevent that by stapling an OCSP response directly inside the TLS handshake. However, that's not easy to do because you need to also deploy it with mechanisms to mandate the use of the stapling. And that's very easy, very difficult to deploy incrementally and securely. And furthermore, if you staple it in TLS, that may solve the problem for TLS, but how does it solve the problem for all the other applications in the industry that want to use the PKI? It doesn't, right? Because it's a TLS specific solution. So anyway, there's many problems with revocation in the existing system. The next one is that most CAs can only issue only the very most basic capabilities of a certificate, right? So if you're thinking of using an advanced capability, say, for example, you want to more precisely compartmentalize the security of a specific application running at a domain name which has many other applications, you can't do that. There's no way the public CA system doesn't support that today. And lastly, I'd say there's a fundamental reliance on the DNS by the public CA system anyway, right? Ultimately, application services on the internet are identified by domain names, and those have to be secure. And think about mechanisms like domain validated certificates. They're pretty easy to get, right? So if you can spoof the DNS, then you can trick a CA into giving you a certificate for some other person that you shouldn't have gotten a certificate for, right? So these are deep-seated problems in the public CA ecosystem, and they really should be solved. And these are also not theoretical problems. There's a long history of compromises in the CA industry. I'm not going to go through any of these. I've just given you some links for reference. Often they're used, they're because of compromises by some malicious third party, but often they're due to sheer incompetence and negligence on the part of the CH. Right? There's some very bad CAs out there, right? So it's a terrible problem, really. I said that we don't have no name constraints in the PKI. If you talk to PKI people, some of them will come back and say, okay, well, technically the PKI specs support names constraint. There is an extension that does that, and that is in fact true. However, it will never be able to be deployed in the public CA system because it doesn't match the business model of the public CAs. They don't want to be constrained in which customers they issue certificates for. They want to be able to issue certificates for everyone. So it's never going to work. The only way it could work is if we re-architect the Internet PKI to have a hierarchy and namespaces. And at that point, you might as well use DNSSEC because DNSSEC already has that, right? And then, you know, the CA industry, they keep coming up with band-aids. One of them is certificate transparency, you may have heard of, which is a mechanism that allows you to retroactively detect certificate misissuance, but we don't need retroactive solutions. We have to have proactive solutions. You want to prevent misissuance in the first place. You don't want to find out after the fact that something was misissued and have to clean it up, right? So it's not very good even. So how can DANE help? Well, firstly, DNSSEC has one root. It doesn't have a gazillion roots of varying qualities. And that one root is highly secured and highly trusted, number one. Number two, because it has hierarchy and zones, it naturally supports namespace constraints. So you can muck around with your part of the namespace. You can't do it to any other piece of the DNS. It has much more timely revocation mechanisms. And the way it does revocation is by just shortening the TTLs and deleting, pulling DNS records out. That's revocation is as simple as that. It just works. There are more advanced capabilities that can be used. You don't even have to use certificates. You can use the DNS to stick raw public keys in them if you don't want to deal with the overhead of the certificate and just sign the public key in the certificate. That works too. And you can have a multi-function, multi-layered PKI, right? So you can superimpose distinct types of PKI on the same DNS namespace just by designing new types of DANE records that are tailor-made for different applications. That works too. That is also a capability that the web PKI does not possess. All right. And could it have been different? There was an interesting comment that I heard from Ryan Sleevey, who worked at Google at the time at a recent ITF meeting. He did a bunch of research into the early histories of the Internet PKI and how it evolved. And he came up with this comment that he found that the web PKI was really a quick hack because DNSSEC, which was still being designed at the time, wasn't ready, right? So you could have imagined a different and better world, but it didn't happen, right? So what applications can use DANE? Potentially many. In practice today, it's mostly a niche application. I would say it's used pretty extensively in one arena, SMTP transport security, and to smaller extents, it's used in other application communities, XMPP Jabber, and some object message security applications. The killer application, of course, would be the web, if we could get the web to use DANE. And in fact, there have been many efforts to get the web to use DANE. And I spent a lot of my time trying to make it happen in the web. And ultimately, those efforts failed because of very intense technical disagreements in the IETF, which I'm not going to recount for you now, but I wrote my own account of that effort and how it failed and why it failed in this blog article, Wither DANE, that you can read if you go. But it's an interesting story, and it's I don't like to think about it too much because it's too painful. But anyway, there you go. So DANE has another potential problem, which is DANE means application security. That means delivering DNSSEC and DANE down to the applications running on your computer or desktop, which means you're potentially exposed to an age-old problem in internet infrastructure these days, which you may know about, the middlebox problem, right? Middlebox often impede the deployment and use of new protocols. DANE potentially also has a problem. There are solutions that have been developed. So there's something called the TLS DNSSEC chain extension. This is a protocol that I was involved in designing. That's a way to kind of shuttle DNSSEC and DANE responses inside the TLS handshake where it can completely bypass the middle boxes invisibly. But there are other possibilities. You could, for example, imagine running DNS queries over some secure transport like DNS over HTTPS, which is much more likely to be able to successfully traverse middle boxes. So that's another possibility too. So there's potential impediments, but there are also potential solutions. All right. So this is another emerging case that I'm not going to go through in the interest of time, but I've talked to Yushin and her students a bit about. But DANE has other potential uses like client authentication and stuff, so you can look it up later. So let me move on to the next interesting development in recent times in DNS, and that is DNS privacy. All right, so let me give you a little bit of background first. Everyone remember Edward Snowden? So that was circa 2013, 2014. So in the wake of the so what did the Edward Snowden revelations actually say to us? That some unnamed government was conducting massive dragnet surveillance on the internet, right? And this had to be stopped. So the IETF, the main standards development organization for the internet protocols, they published RFC 7258 in, I think, early 2014, maybe mid, in which they declared that pervasive monitoring is an attack and that we must protect against this attack intentionally by designing protocols to prevent that attack, right? So, and the goal is to make either such monitoring infeasible or at least very, very costly to conduct, right? So that was an explicit pivot in one of the IETF's core principles at the time. So what is its relation to DNS per se versus TLS or other protocols where you need privacy of, putting your credit card to some website and so on, right? So let's think about the original DNS protocol had no privacy. It was never planned. All DNS packets were sent in clear text, and it was at the time of the Edward Snowden revelations too. And we had DNSSEC at the time, but remember, DNSSEC is about data authentication. It is not about encrypting or protecting privacy of that data. And indeed, the prevailing notion at the time was DNS data are inherently public, right? Anyone can look up www.amazon.com. Why do I need to encrypt it or protect it, right? So that was the prevailing thinking at the time. But then the realization came that, okay, well, DNS data itself may be public, but the DNS query response traffic probably should not be. And that benefits from privacy protection, right? So remember, queries and responses are indeed metadata that can expose privacy-sensitive information about your communications. So think, for example, if you did a DNS lookup of a drug rehab website, right? So that probably reveals, gives some clues about your intentions, right? That you may not want to advertise to the world. So the fact that the drug rehab's website name and address are public doesn't matter. The fact that you, an individual, queried it does matter, and that deserves privacy protection, right? You with me so far? All right. So there are many techniques for privacy. I'm going to gloss over this slide too. So one obvious technique is if you want to make data more private, minimize the data that the protocol exposes, right? That's one obvious technique that can be used. And there are methods that have been developed in the DNS arena that do precisely this. I'm just going to mention them to you so you are aware that they exist and you can look up the details. There are things like query name minimization and aggressive negative caching. And the rest of my remarks will focus on confidentiality protection, so encrypting. So there is a movement afoot in the DNS industry to move all DNS queries and responses to operate over authenticated and encrypted transports, okay? So as early as 2016, we developed DNS over TLS. It hasn't had a giant impact on the ecosystem yet. There are pockets of deployment. but it essentially runs DNS directly over TLS. It uses a dedicated port 853. Much more interesting, and a little bit later came another proposal, DNS over HTTPS, which runs DNS over the same channel as the encrypted web, right? TCP 443. And I'll get back to this in a minute. And lastly, most recently, 2022, last year, we standardized DNS over QUIC. So QUIC, as you may know, is a new UDP-based transport protocol that has already been adopted in the web to some extent. It offers a number of advantages, multi-streaming with no head-of-line blocking. So there's an option for DNS to go over that too. But let's return to DOE a little bit. DNS over HTTPS arrived relatively recently, but unlike many other protocols, it has already caused dramatic, far-reaching changes in the ecosystem, and very quickly. And the reason is it is being championed by web browsers, and the web browser industry is highly concentrated. Right? There's 3 or 4 big players. If they gang up and decide to do something together, then things happen fast, right? So this is an advantage that many other protocol communities like DNS doesn't have. Like DNS doesn't have 3 companies that can get together and say, we're going to do this and the whole world is going to have to adapt. They can't do that. But the web doesn't quite have that power, but they have much more power than other application communities. So you might be wondering, well, you could run DNS over TLS. That provides exactly the same protection. If you run DNS over HTTP over TLS, aren't you just adding another layer of overhead? And why would we do that? Okay. So the answer to that question is there's 2 primary motives. First is a little bit of an innocuous one, which is it's driven by the web industry. Web applications traditionally are used to using HTTP-based APIs, and they want to use an HTTP-based system to also conduct DNS operations, right? So that makes sense. The second one, though, is the most interesting one, is the one that's causing the most commotion. And that is that a lot of the big proponents of DOE explicitly have a goal that one of the reasons you should use DOE is we want to completely prevent any on-path device from intercepting, looking at, mucking around with DNS packets. Okay, so how is this possible? You might imagine, right? So the way it could happen is, imagine if you co-located a DNS resolver service with a very popular web service like Google, right? So you can't then suddenly decide to block the DNS traffic without causing collateral damage because you block Google and maybe your users need to use Google, all right? So that's the way it could happen. That is an explicit goal. And as you can imagine, this is a little bit of a battle that's going on now because of this, because network security operators, a lot of security people do not like this because they want to be able to see their users' DNS queries, because DNS inspection has been, you can debate whether this is a good idea or not, has always been for a long time a core component of their defense posture, right? So screening out bad sites, all that kind of stuff, right? Malware, block lists, you guys know all this, right? So they don't like it at all. I should talk about the scope of current DNS privacy efforts. So at the moment, it's limited to this path between the DNS client and the recursive server. And the reason is that's the most crucial part. That's where individual user queries can most easily be identified, right? So the queries coming from the other side are aggregated from many clients behind the resolver, right? So you have more protection from just the fact that you're hiding in a crowd, okay? But here, you can identify individual users. So that's the focus. We're going to encrypt this path. There is a second phase plan, which is encrypt the recursive server to authoritative server path. So people are looking at it and planning it, but it hasn't really happened yet. And not everybody in the authoritative server community is even on board with this plan, right? Because if you talk to some of the root server operators, if you talk to VeriSign, they've actually said publicly that they're not going to do it, right? Because they don't feel the need to spend billions of dollars upgrading their infrastructure to support TLS, because I can't identify users on this path, right? So I'm not going to do it, right? So we'll see how that happens. The IETF wants encryption to be deployed pervasively everywhere, but they may not got their way, right? So a lot of things going on in this industry. So Mozilla has taken, of the web browser companies, has taken a very aggressive approach in this arena. So their initial plan was to roll out DNS over HTTPS to all their users everywhere and use it in conjunction with a cloud-based DNS provider, namely Cloudflare was their initial partner, but there's a few others now. And this caused immediate backlash from a lot of people, network security operators, campus network operators. We don't want this. You can't siphon off my users' DNS traffic invisibly and exfiltrate it and go out into some cloud provider that we don't trust. Right? They don't like it at all. So they backed off a little bit. They are defaulting it to only users. And interestingly enough, in another major concession to network operators, they provided hooks where you can easily disable it if you want it, right? So the question is, if it's easy to disable DNS over HTTPS, what is it protecting you from, right? If it's a kind of a little bit of a conundrum, but that's the way things sometimes unfold in this industry. Let me skip over this slide and move on a little bit faster. So let's talk about deployment models a little bit. So as I mentioned, the current scope of DNS privacy is a select, right? So a crucial question is who operates this recursive DNS server? That makes a big difference, right? So if you imagine that the DOH recursive server is operated by your company, your network operator, maybe that's okay. So what changed was the DNS traffic internal to the network to the recursive server was encrypted, right? So that means you couldn't, any network device couldn't look at that traffic, but the company still operates this recursive server, so they can kind of instrument it to do the same kind of block lists and other stuff that they were doing in the past. That still works, okay? So maybe this is an acceptable model of deployment for DOH. The problem is this model that I talked about, right? Where your users are being directed to send DNS traffic to a cloud-based system. And as I mentioned, if this cloud provider co-locates their DNS service with their web server, you got a problem. So now I can't like block it. Otherwise, the campus operator could just block the DNS traffic, right? Say, can't use it, you have to use my DNS servers, and they're done. They didn't cause any collateral damage. If you have this co-location situation, then there's collateral damage. Then you have a big problem. All right. So back to the point that I tried to make earlier is you can have a debate about whether using DNS is a good control point for security operations. Is that wise? I mean, it's not perfect. It has many problems, but in reality, network operators have been doing it for a long time, right? So they are quite upset about these developments. Ideally, this kind of monitoring control is best done at the endpoints themselves by deploying comprehensive endpoint security software. However, that has a cost, right? It's much more costly to do that than to centrally put some security rules in your DNS server. That's much easier, right? Because doing things with the DNS is very easy, right? So ultimately, we may be heading in that direction anyway, but it's not going to be easy or smooth. There's going to be lots of fights about it. There's a very good article on this subject by a colleague of mine, Mark Nottingham. You should read it. It covers this topic in quite some detail. And the other thing I mentioned is this invisibility of network traffic is not a new debate, right? It's coming up in DNS. It's come up before in other protocols like TLS 1.3. You remember if you followed it, they banned the use of any cipher suite that doesn't offer forward secrecy, right? So as a result, TLS interception middle boxes broke, right? And that's caused a huge commotion as well for network security operators. So it's the same kind of problem, different characteristics, the same category of problems, I should say. So what about trust and regulation? So many, if you talk to colleagues outside the United States, many of them see this kind of war as distinctly US-centric, because the arguable reason that Mozilla is doing this is because they don't trust ISPs. They know ISPs in the US look at users' DNS traffic and try to monetize it. Okay, they don't want that. So hence we have DOH to bypass them and protect you against the ISP. In Europe, the situation is dramatically different. ISPs are strongly regulated. They're not allowed to do things like that. So this kind of problem, they'll say, doesn't exist in their realm. And in their view, it is not ISPs should not be trusted, but the big US tech giants who are trying to inflict this protocol on campus network operators. So, should we regulate the cloud DOH providers in the same way as some ISPs are? That's an open question. Maybe that will take care of the problem. And there's a bunch of questions about centralization, which I'll skip through. Let me move ahead a little bit to, so I'm going to go talk about academic contributions. I skipped over a few sections, but I'm hoping you have questions about some of these and we can come back to those. So I wanted to end with academic contributions in space. So there are many academic contributions to alternative naming systems. I've named a few here, and these are all very interesting. But as far as I can tell, they have mostly had only niche deployments, right? So there is no expectation by anyone that they will ever be able to displace the DNS, right? The DNS is, as I mentioned, very successful, very entrenched system that is deployed in so many disparate systems that it would take a Herculean effort to displace it by any alternative system, right? So I think the most likely thing to be successful is incremental changes to the DNS system rather than radical clean slate designs. And this has analogs in other arenas too. For example, for decades, I think, network security researchers have tried to propose replacements for the internet's inter-domain routing system. But guess what? Nothing has ever been able to displace what? BGP, right? What? Okay, all right, you should tell me. Let's have a discussion about it. So I think there are, if you focus specifically not on alternative systems, but the DNS specifically, there is a whole bunch of academic research that's happened in this space. There are quite good academic measurement studies of the DNS ecosystem. Not all of them are great, but some of them are quite good, and they have resulted in, have informed changes to deploy DNS ecosystems. There are many papers that have found bugs and vulnerabilities. I would say most of them are in implementations of the DNS rather than in the DNS protocol itself. However, there are a few that have, from time to time, find weaknesses in the DNS protocol, which we've had to fix too. Obviously, there's ongoing work in various areas. So there's something called oblivious DNS, which I think I mentioned to you earlier in a meeting. I'll skip over that for now. And then, of course, the all-embracing threat of the quantum computer is relevant to DNS too, right? So there is work going on introducing post-quantum signature algorithm for DNSSEC. And I know some of the people who are working on this, and I can introduce them to you if you want to work on that topic, or maybe you already are. But lastly, I want to talk about this failures too. Most of the failures, I would say, fall into the category of attempts at designing or redesigning parts of the protocol. And I'm going to pick on myself, actually, because I was involved in one of them. So there's something called NSEC 5 that I worked on. And what it is DNSSEC has a feature called authenticated denial of existence. And what that means is proving cryptographically that something doesn't exist, like a domain name or a specific record type. And the current mechanism has an unfortunate side effect that it potentially allows an adversary to enumerate the contents of a zone. There are some defenses against this, but they are not perfect. So NSEC 5 was a collaboration between some academic computer scientists and cryptographers, and some folks in the DNS industry, including myself, to comprehensively plug this hole. We took it to the IETF. We had a bunch of good discussions about it. In almost every way, it was superior to the existing mechanism, yet it failed to get adopted in the IETF, right? So that's a kind of a telling story. And the reason is because it required changes to every DNS stack. And that's a big ask. And the argument and the pushback was the existing mechanism, while not perfect, is good enough. And the DNS operator community was unwilling to bear the burden of the expense of deploying a new protocol to replace it. So that's kind of a interesting lesson for anyone proposing to do enhancement to the DNS. And lastly, where can academic researchers engage DNS practitioners? There's a number of venues. I think probably one of the most interesting ones is the IETF, which I've already mentioned several times in the talk. They host a very good workshop once a year called the Applied Network Research Workshop. I think some of you probably are familiar with this, but it attracts a fair number of researchers. So it's a very good venue to propose academic research that you are trying to get deployed in a real ecosystem. Okay. There's the IRTF, which is the sister organization to the IETF, which focuses more on longer term research. So that attracts a lot of academic types. And there are DNS focused venues like DNSORG. So that's the thing that Yishin mentioned earlier that I'm on the board of directors for. They host a twice yearly workshop that brings together, it's probably the premier industry organization, DNS practitioners, companies, and to a smaller extent, researchers and academics. So it's a very good venue to engage folks. And of course, I can. So anyway, I'm interested in having a discussion with you about how you think academics could better contribute to the space and help us make the DNS better. But with that, I will stop and see if there are any comments or questions.
All right, let's thank our speakers.
Thank you. And just to, did you folks find this useful? Was this, all right, okay, great. Thank you.
So I have a question about DNS over HTTPS.
Yeah.
And so you use kind of an analogy to kind of articulate that. You can go back to the picture. Okay, that. Yeah.
This one or this one?
The other one where you start. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here it's equivalent to taking a phone book and looking up the number in secret, but you still have to dial the number. So here you could look up, say you're at Google and they don't want you going to Microsoft.com.
Yeah.
So you do the lookup. That's completely secret.
Yes.
You get the IP address back and have to contact the Microsoft.com server.
Right.
So some firewall there would still be able to listen for the IP address that you look up to get the result.
Correct. Yes.
So you still look up as private. The access is not.
Yes, correct. Right. There has to be, I mean, DNS doesn't work in isolation. You have to do something with another application protocol after DNS. So your observation is precisely correct. So you mentioned IP address, right? So yes, you can block things at the level of IP address if you know what IP address to block. That's true, but IP addresses are different from DNS, right? So you could have done it anyway, right? Even without the DNS. So that's my first comment on your observation, even though it's correct. The second comment is, yes, you hit on a different point, a distinct point, that even if you protected and made the DNS query and response visible, there could be a later stage of your application where something is still visible. And in fact, there is. It's not just IP address. The domain name is actually still visible. And I'll tell you why. I think I have a slide about this. Yeah, okay. So typically, you'll do a DNS query and you'll connect to a website over TLS, right? Guess what? TLS exposes the domain name as well in something called the SNI extension, server name indication. And that is a clear text protocol element in TLS today. There is work going on to fix it. There's something called encrypted client hello, which will come later and fix this problem. But today, there is no solution to this problem, which means that, yes, you're absolutely right. DNS over HTTPS is an incomplete solution today. There's still opportunity to inspect DNS names or IP address and block the traffic at a subsequent stage. Okay, but very good question. Thank you for asking it. Yes.
So very, very interesting. I taught actually Daniel and I both taught the networking class here. At,
oh, cool, excellent.
Which is in both EC and CS, and so this I think is really helpful. One question I have is about the DANE and the certificate authority part of this. So one, like for example, Let's Encrypt. I mean, that really lowered the barrier to getting a certificate and being able to secure your own web server.
Correct.
Does DANE kind of reverse that trend a little bit? Because with Let's Encrypt, right, I could shop, or with a certificate authority, right? The flip side of that is I can shop for any certificate authority, whoever's going to sell it to me for the cheapest or be the easiest to use. But if I'm restricted in wherever my DNS zone is, maybe they're not as friendly. Maybe they don't support me running like 15 different servers for my research group. So I'm just kind of curious what the implications are there.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And certainly there are potential implications. The answer to that, does it make it easier or harder? Is it depends, right? It depends on who's running your DNS and how amenable they are to supporting these mechanisms, right? So if you have, DNS infrastructure operators who love DANE and have made easy mechanisms for you to make the DANE assertions for your public keys or certificates, it might be very easy, okay? But the opposite could also be true. Maybe you have a DNS operators in your company that you can get on board with the scheme and then you're stuck, right? So, but what I will say is, in theory, it could be easy as Let's Encrypt, maybe easier, right? Because if you have a fully automated DNS infrastructure that offers self-service capability for client applications to register DNS records for their own services, I could imagine it could be even easier than Let's Encrypt, right? But that's not the reality today. A lot of it depends on software infrastructure being developed to allow you to do those kind of things. So I think in theory, it's possible. What the reality is, as I said, it depends.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, here UVA registering a new like subdomain is pretty easy.
Okay.
You could imagine that just comes with it.
Right. Yeah. So the other barrier to entry for DANE is, of course, DANE crucially depends on your DNS infrastructure deploying DNSSEC, right? So as I said, DNSSEC deployment is still relatively sparse. So your organization would have had to do the prerequisite work of implementing DNSSEC first before they could even answer your question, right? Yeah. But very good question. Thank you. Yeah.
With certain DNS lookups like DNS dumpster and things like that, if you have like a private self-contained like infrastructure that you built, but obviously that you have to have it talk to some different service in order for it to like work. Is there any way you can block your IP address from showing up on any of these like DNS dumpsters, or is it
Right.
or is that something that's just not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what type of DNS infrastructure you talk about. So in this talk, I mostly focused on the public DNS system, right? So, but in corporate networks, often people run private DNS systems, private views of a DNS namespace that's only visible internal to their organization. You've been able to see, even from private DNS domains, you've been able to see, okay, so that probably what's happening is somebody is somehow exfiltrating those DNS queries out of your network and going to these DNS dumpsters and other sites, right? So how that's happening is I have no idea, but there's probably plenty of ways people have figured out how to do things like that, right? So how can you prevent it? I don't know. I mean, by locking down your network as rigorously as you can, right? But in the end, it's like it's a little bit of a arms race, right? So you develop defenses and clever attackers come up with new ways to work around their defenses. Yeah. Okay. Are there any students in the audience who would like to ask questions? I'm just curious, since I came to a university. Did you find this talk useful?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Previously, I worked with a professor in Florida and Aaron Scribble. He has some, it's not on the DNS only, but it's network measurements, like this thing. So
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, so I'm talking with Yishin and her students about collaborating on some DNS research projects. So I'm always interested in hearing from other folks in academia who have interesting research ideas that the kind of the professional DNS community can help you with, because in my opinion, the best research results when these two kinds of folks collaborate, right? Anyway, Yeah.
One of the things that really scares me about DNS over HTTPS is that, so I'm Chrome or Firefox, I'm gonna have to run this service myself. And so if I'm Google and I run DNS over HTTPS, it's encrypted through the network, but Google can still see all the DNS queries. And
correct.
if that means that there's a competitor for Google, and I can see that people are starting to use that competitor because they can see all the DNS queries, I can crush or
Yes.
or block that competitor. So I can decide to say, hey, I have to slow down the DNS responses for my new Google cookie because we're using the centralized group.
Right. Yes, your observation is precisely correct. Right. So the resolver operator, if it's Google in this case, can see all your queries, even though it went over the network fully encrypted. Is that a good or bad thing? Yeah, I mean, if Google is inspecting your traffic and then trying to use that data to gain an advantage over their competitors, yes, that's a bad thing, right? And do they actually do that? If you look at so this has been a part of the debate since the beginning about DONE. Can we trust these guys, right? And their response has been the same. Cloudflare, Google, and all these guys say, hey, yes, in theory, we could do that, but guess what? We have a detailed privacy policy that is written that says we will never do that, okay? So is that good enough? Can you trust them? So I'll leave that to you to decide, right? Everyone will have to decide for themselves if you believe that, right? Maybe they'll follow their privacy policy until there's a market downturn and then they have to make more money. Okay, we're going to monetize the data now, right? So it is a problem. So, but I will mention there are potential solutions to that problem. There is something that I mentioned in the research section, which I think I mentioned to you, Al, right, earlier. It's called oblivious DNS over HTTPS. Where is it? Yeah, okay. Poor man's Tor, right? I kind of made fun of it a little bit with my parenthetical comment there, but so it's not as good as Tor. That's what I meant, right? It implements one leg of Tor, but there has been a proposed solution to kind of obfuscate the data that a cloud-based DNS system receives, right? And that's called oblivious Tor. And there's a protocol design that exists. Cloudflare has implemented this, and a few other people have. I would encourage you to look that up and see if it addresses it. Actually, I'll tell you, without going into details, it doesn't address all the concerns that you raised in your question, but it addresses some of them in the sense that it obfuscates, it detaches the identity of the query of the record, from the query of the record itself by inserting another entity like a oblivious proxy in between the recursive server and the client. So it's unclear how many people will actually deploy this, but there's an experiment going on where it has been deployed by Cloudflare. Okay. Yes.
I was wondering if we use DANE for replace the current PKI system. I was wondering if there could be any misuse case for DANE using authentication. Because for the current PKI, we know there could be like some maybe misissued or this kind of stuff. What would you like to see in cases if we use DANE?
Yeah, so there could be, I mean, but the scope of the misissuance is much smaller. So obviously, people can make security mistakes and issue a certificate. So that can happen even with DANE. But the difference is you messed up your own infrastructure. You didn't hurt anybody else. With the public CA system, a misissuance can hurt a broad set of people. Right? So you could screw up the issuance of a certificate for something in your own zone, but that's on you. You can also fix it. You couldn't get a misissued certificate for Princeton.edu or another organization you have nothing to do with. Okay, does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
All right, so it's past 3:10, so we're gonna end the official Q&A right now. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
I'm gonna kind of hang around here for a while, grab some refreshments, more questions. Feel free to just come up here. We can have a more casual chat.
Okay. Right. However.
I like it.
Okay. You'll have to ask your colleagues later.
Okay.
Get honest feedback. I went over time a little bit because.
It's
Wasn't too bad,
actually,
right?
it's all good, actually.